Uh, Good evening. My name is Brian. I am a peer with Goochland Powhatan Community Service Board. I represent, I'm a member of RSAAC as well as a member of the Rural Overdose and Outreach Team, which is a partner of RSAAC in a post-overdose response. So RSAAC was established in 2013. RSAAC stands for the Rural Substance Awareness and Action Coalition. It's individuals and organizations locally that are interested in addressing substance use in the Goochland, Powhatan counties. The mission is to increase understanding, and especially compassion, be champions of those in recovery, and do our best to prevent substance misuse. We have a vision of supportive, connective, and resilient rural Virginia. So thank you everybody for attending and joining, those on Zoom too. Our sponsors today, Department of Behavioral Health and Development Services. It's making this possible for us. We always like to be impressed by Junie and the church here. Thank you very much for this wonderful place. The VCU Ramsden Recovery staff for all the support doing to set this up, and the Chickahominy Health District staff as well for setting up the resource tables and having things available. So again, everybody, thank you for making this possible, and we look forward to seeing what happens. Housekeeping, general things to do. Bathrooms are past the center of the lobby there, past the desk over on the right-hand side. We ask that you silence all your electronics if you're in the room here with us, just to show Tom the respect to listen. Help yourself at any point to the refreshments. There is an amazing spread back there, so go for it. And please visit our resource table and ask any of us what's available there to take home. So now, Tom, many alphabets after the name. Some of them I don't know what they are, but that's all right. He is the biggest thing. He's the Assistant Director of Substance Use and Recovery Support at VCU. He's a person in long-term recovery, and obviously you will see passionate about changing the way we treat substance use, and firmly believes that we must improve our systems of care. We're focusing on long-term recovery supports and allowing easier access to treatment and recovery resources. This covers education and supporting family members, reducing stigma all around substance use. So Tom directs the Ramsden Recovery, which is the largest collegiate program in Virginia, and oversees an expansion grant through the Department of Behavioral Health and Development Services to expand recovery supports at 9 schools in the Commonwealth. He loves to help people in recovery find purpose and passion in their new career paths, and especially enjoys teaching and expanding the peer workforce and profession. He spent the first 7 years of his career working with people experiencing homelessness at Caritas. He also lives in Richmond with his partner Jules, his daughter Inez, and his dog Murphy. So please help me welcome Tom.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Thanks. All right. Cool. Hey, everybody. See some familiar faces. Grateful to be here. Can you hear me in the back if I don't use the mic? Are you good? Just hand signal at me if you can't hear me and I can use the mic, but it's just easier not to. So my name's Tom Bannard. I'm a person in long-term recovery. For me, that means that things got really, really dark for me in December of 2006. I was in a lot of legal trouble. I had burned up a lot of really important relationships in my life. The people I was surrounding myself with were not kind of people that were expressing the values that I grew up with. And I was actively suicidal. And I was very, very fortunate that when I kind of hit this really dark spot in my life, that my folks had access to some good resources. They had access to some people that knew something about addiction. And I was very fortunate to end up going into treatment, getting long-term treatment, having recovery support and education for my family, and then kind of moved on from there and got back into Richmond in a really supportive recovery environment, got really active in the local recovery community. And also when I went back to school, there was a collegiate recovery program at the school that I went to. And one of the things I learned very quickly as I started working in the field of addiction was that the things that were there and available to me were not things that are available to the vast majority of Americans, even today, almost 18 years later. And that I was really fortunate, both in terms of some amount of just luck because of relationships that my family had, and a great deal of privilege because they had access to insurance and could help pay for treatment that at that time was not available to a lot of people in this country, and in many ways it's still not available. So that's kind of shaped this purpose that I've had in my life, is how do we do better in terms of providing the support that not just allow people to survive addiction, right, and get through and be alive, which is incredibly important, of course, but also to kind of build a life in recovery. And that's kind of what wakes me up in the morning. Well, right now, what wakes me up in the morning is my 18-month-old daughter. So let me just share for virtual folks. So is that sharing right, John? Cool. All right, so this is Inez. So, this has been such a gift in recovery. Is it sharing now, John? Okay. Give me 1 second here. We've done a lot of hybrid. A lot of the recovery meetings that meet in our recovery clubhouse are hybrid, and we've really, I think it's made a big difference to a lot of folks to have access to things that they didn't have access to because of the virtual environment. So we're just gonna try to make that work. Is that the? How's that? Okay, beautiful. All right. So it's my daughter, and yeah, it's just kind of changed my whole world. I was, fortunate to kind of have built a pretty good life in recovery before she was born, and it just gets better and better. Okay. So as was said before, I spent the first 7 years of my career working at Caritas, which is a organization that does homeless services and addiction recovery support, based out of Richmond. A lot of folks in this area are familiar with Caritas because we operated at one time, Caritas operated a number of mobile shelter beds. So they would stay, so our participants would stay at churches for a week, and then they would move to another church. And, it was an amazing effort by a lot of people to provide care over a long period of time. It's not a very kind of trauma-informed or very cost-effective way to deliver services. And so they've switched that model since then. And they really are focused around kind of recovery supports now. But it was a really important kind of formative experience for me to work at Caritas and with the Healing Places long-term recovery program there as well. And then I've been at Ramsden Recovery. I've been involved with Ramsden Recovery for about a decade. So we are a collegiate recovery program. So this means kind of structured supports for students who are in recovery from addiction who are in college. So most people don't argue with me when I say, college campuses are recovery hostile environments, right? Like that. These are not places that generally are known for being supportive of people who are trying to stop their substance use or significantly reduce their substance use. And so within that environment, however, when you create community, when you create opportunities for people to be supported, where people can be their whole selves, they really thrive. And so we have a pretty large community at VCU. We have about 120, 130 students involved each semester. We're able to serve students that are not just at VCU, but students that are at any not-for-profit college, university, trade school in the state through a scholarship program. And so that's been really cool because unfortunately, I don't know that it's realistic to think that they're going to be a similar program at colleges across the state. And so it's really nice that students can have this space where they can connect with each other. And so often people think, oh, I'm the only person on my job that's in recovery. I'm the only person on this campus that's in recovery. I'm the only person, you name it, that's in my church, that's in recovery, right? And so until there's spaces for people to gather, until we intentionally create opportunities for people to join together in community, then people think they're alone, right? Even if they're very stable in their recovery, it can be a really isolating experience. So that's really a big piece of what Rams in Recovery is about. I'm going to kind of reference some of the things that we do in Rams in Recovery throughout the talk, in part because I want this to be practical for folks that have family members that are impacted by addiction. I don't want to just kind of talk about theory. I want to think about, okay, what might this look like in our lives? How do we kind of apply some of these concepts in our lives? So I'll be talking some about what that looks like for us. I'm going to use some dark humor here. There's going to be some tongue-in-cheek humor here about addiction. So I'm going to kind of set up this top 10 list thing, and I'm going to have a statement, and then I'm going to have kind of a contrary statement. And I don't mean this to make light of the experience of addiction or the experience of family members with a loved one with addiction. This is incredible. It's an incredibly hard thing to walk through. But it's, for me, it's kind of meant to like identify, sure, this guy can stand up here and talk about like being kind and loving towards your loved one who is in active addiction, who is really struggling, who is behaving in ways that are really hard to live with, right? And he can say, oh, you've got to be kind to them and loving. And it's really hard to do that, right, in practice. And so I just want to kind of acknowledge this like tension, right? Because part of what we've got, right, is that we've got a person whose brain is heavily impacted by their addiction, by their substance use, right? And that is playing out in ways that are often, destroying our family, hurting relationships in our family. And one of the things I think that a lot of families find really helpful is to be able to separate out the disease of addiction from the individual who has the disease of addiction, right? And so be able to kind of shift this language to say, we're not saying this is how you're affecting me, this is how addiction is affecting me, right? And it's a really helpful way to remember what is wonderful about your loved one, right? Is to say that there's kind of this third party involved, which is addiction, right? And it can be a really helpful metaphor. So the other thing I want to name here, just from this little meme or whatever, or cartoon, is that, it is a traumatic experience to watch your loved one's life be impacted by addiction, right? And so it is really common for family members to act in ways that if they were in their best place, they would not act, right? Or to do things that you're like, oh, I just wish I hadn't said that way. Or what if I said, this or that, right? Or I wish I hadn't reacted that way. And it is the most normal thing in the world, right, to do that when you're watching, your loved one struggle in front of you, right, to react, right, in a way that's like, I'm going to do whatever I can to save their life, right? And to react just out of instinct and not react sometimes from the best place, right? And so it acknowledges, sometimes like having a little humor, being able to like step back from it, or just have a space where you can just laugh or cry or do whatever you need to do to just recognize that this thing that you're going through as a family member, yeah, the thing that your loved one is going through is really hard, but this thing that you are going through as a family member is really hard. And in some ways, you're probably more present for it than your loved one is, right? Because you're maybe going through it without kind of a substance to mask it or to walk through it. Okay. So the other thing is, and we're going to try to do this with the virtual participants and you all as well, is that, family recovery takes community. So we're going to do, I think just, if you've done a training with me, you know that I usually do breakout spaces. Like I try to get you to talk to each other. So I'm only going to do one breakout space today, but I do want us to talk to each other, right? Because community really helps us walk through hard things. And so if nothing else, if there's nothing you get from my talk, maybe you leave here with a number of somebody else that's going through some similar stuff. Okay, cool. All right. So, so I'm going to set these all up. It's going to be, I'm not bad, I'm sick, or, it'll be one statement, but also kind of the conflict that is created by addiction, right? So, so 10 things that your loved one wishes that you knew about addiction, but wouldn't tell you, right? And the first is that your loved one is not a bad person because they have addiction, right? And, right, we wouldn't have all of the stuff that we have, connected to addiction. It wouldn't be so hard if the reality wasn't that people do bad things. They don't act as their best selves, right? Connected to their substance use, right? And so for a really long time, societally in the United States, we've done a especially horrific job of treating people that have addiction as human beings, and blaming people for their addiction and blaming people for, not just blaming, the person for their addiction, but also blaming other people for that person's addiction, right? And so I want to kind of start here with just a quick breakout conversation. We're going to take about 5 minutes or so and get a group of 3 or 4 people. And we're gonna have a little conversation just about this kind of, what is your lens? Like, what's the lens? How were you shaped to think about substance use? So what did communication about substance use look like in your family of origin? Okay, so we're just gonna take a couple minutes in a group of 3 or 4, and we're gonna do this in breakout rooms for the Zoom as well. So if you're not in a place that you can join a breakout room, if you're on the Zoom, just it'll invite you, just don't go, and we'll make the rooms work. But I want you to think about, okay, what did communication, think about what were the messages that were said out loud, right? What are the messages that were conveyed, but they were never spoken, right? Because we can say a lot of things by not saying anything, okay? And how did that differ depending on what substance we were talking about, right? Is it different for alcohol or cannabis or illicit drugs, opioids, heroin? How did that differ? Okay, how did that play out in your families? So try to kind of turn around, get a small group. Brian will join a group if there's a group that's too small. And we're going to take about 5 minutes or so for folks to just have a little bit of a conversation. All right, folks coming back now. 34 seconds. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna do that. Okay. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Hope folks on the Zoom had a good breakout. So as a heads up, so we're recording just me, but if you do share or ask a question, your voice will be on it, but your face will not be. So I just want to give folks full transparency there. Would anybody like to just kind of share in general or anything you noticed or observed about the conversation without kind of sharing other people's experiences that are not yours to share? Okay. Yeah.
In a group of four.
So that the Zoomers can hear you. It won't amplify your voice, but.
In a group of four, it's just interesting to hear how different everyone's communication style, communication comfort, and communication period was while they were growing up, and how it affected them and how they handle the communication themselves now.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can have very, very different experiences within families, within culture, right? Within, religion, right? We can have very different messages religiously by generation. We might have heard very, very different messages. And even within communities, we might have very different messages. There might have been a lot of active substance use, but nobody talked about substance use, right? And that's a set of messages, right? There might have been a lot of folks struggling with it, but we couldn't talk about it at all. So those are all really kind of normal experiences. And I think one of the things that's really helpful here is that just acknowledging that we're all biased, right? We all walk into these conversations with our own stuff, right? And so, our experience is very much like shaped by that lived experience, especially growing up, maybe some educational experience. And so we're sometimes like we really have to check our biases at the door if we really want to be helpful, right? Or we have to kind of question, be willing to say, well, maybe actually the messages that I got around this are not serving me very well when I'm interacting with my loved one, right? Maybe the environment I grew up in was, no, we don't do that. We don't talk about it. And we don't do it. And you got that message fine. And you didn't do it. Right. And then you gave that message out and you had a different result, right? Raising your kids or something else. Right. And so that's really normal. And I think even just starting to have some conversations around this can be really powerful because it's very isolating, right? The experience of having a family member with substance use for many, many families is extremely isolating, right? And so that prevents us from getting kind of the help and support that we need. Does anybody else want to share anything?
Nobody wants to share, Tom. That's just how breakout rooms go. But there is, I have things in the chat. So
okay, yeah. Do you want to read out a couple
the
things?
Chat is not as
Is
afraid
active
to share. So
yeah.
Hector says, always had that aunt or uncle that you were told to never be like.
Yeah.
Don't be like.
Yeah, Uncle John.
Don't be like Uncle John. He's great, but
yeah, we have those stories in our families, right? And different ways that we deal with it.
And then Karen said that their group talked about the secrecy.
Okay.
Like the secrecy of that.
Yeah.
Of use or of not using or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And some of that comes from, being in being a lot of recovery, being in anonymous programs. And what does an anonymity mean? Does that mean I don't talk about it?
Yeah.
Or if I do talk about it, how do I talk about it? Right. A lot of secrecy in families or taboo in discussing.
Yeah. Right. So
the breakout rooms are really, they're very active.
I heard some wonderful conversations going on. So I hope folks are kind of going home with some relationships, just some community, right? Because we have so much silence around this, right? So So kind of back to these kind of back and forths, right? I may lie sometimes, but not everything I say is a lie, right? Good luck telling the difference as a family member, right? And I think this is just one of the fundamental, really big challenges that we have, like in families or workplaces or whatever around addiction, right? Is that there's this distrust, right? That comes because people are often dishonest about their use because they're protecting this thing that is working for them, right? In some way. And if nothing else, a thing to consider is that your loved one's use and other behaviors make sense, okay? There are good reasons behind what they are doing, okay? So it's really easy to think about substance use and addiction and late stage addiction as pathological, like this doesn't make any sense. And if you take the perspective, okay, how could I understand this as making sense to this person in this moment? You are much more likely to come to them from a place of empathy and care, and you're much more likely to be effective with them when you say, okay, what is going on here? That this thing that doesn't seem, this behavior that doesn't seem to make any sense to me on the outside might actually make sense to them, right? So when I think about this piece about dishonesty and lying, because this is a really hard thing for family members. I love this little meme. There's lots of situations where you just know, right? You just know that they are not telling you the truth, right? You just know, right? And I think I really like this this quote, right? To observe without judging is the highest form of human intelligence. Okay. How does it make sense that my loved one is being dishonest about this thing? Right? How what are they protecting through this dishonesty? Okay. Trying to separate out from this is not how I raised this person, or this is not how the person was, or these are not the values that I tried to instill in this person, right? Or they're treating me like trash, right? By lying to me, by being dishonest, right? Taking it really personally, okay? How does it make sense? And so I'll give you kind of some practical examples from the way that we try to do this in terms of our recovery program at VCU. So what we talk about is we want to minimize anybody's incentive to be dishonest, especially about their use, okay? Because use is most dangerous when people are being dishonest about it, right? So we have tiered services. So we have, open recovery meetings, then we have like recovery coaching, and we have a scholarship program, and we have a housing program, okay? And so our expectations of our students are different depending on which program they are in, right? So in housing, right, we are trying to create a safe recovery environment, okay? And so we, use is not acceptable within recovery housing, right? That we really think it's really important to really pay attention to what's going on there. And if somebody is having active use, that we need to address it quickly and immediately, right? And so what we do in that environment is to say, okay, we expect that sometimes people are going to have episodes of use, right? And what we try to do is basically set up a situation where if you come forward, right, we can really work with you, right, in terms of keeping you in housing. But if you're dishonest, if you're kind of hiding your use, then we're not going to be able to work with you. But one of the things that we have that really works well for us is that if somebody is in our recovery housing on campus and they're not in line with the expectations of recovery housing, but they're not breaking bigger university rules, then we can move them out of recovery housing, but into other housing on our campus, right? And so we are trying to set up an environment where we can just have an honest conversation. If you don't want to meet these expectations, then we're going to kind of move you somewhere else. You may have to deal with the other consequences of your use, right? But we don't want to create a situation where you are going to become homeless because you were dishonest about your use, right? And so that's kind of one of the ways that we've done that. And so just really thinking about your interactions with your loved one is like, am I intentionally or unintentionally creating like incentives for them to be dishonest with me, right? Because then I'm kind of building these distrust barriers, right? Whereas if I can find ways that, you know, their honesty is, it's okay, right? For them to say, yeah, I'm really struggling, right? Or yeah, I used last night. That's a much better situation, right? We can move forward from there. Easier said than done. Okay. I am not in as much denial as it appears, right? But try to get me to admit it, right? So, you know, almost all the students, people that I work with, right, have severe substance use disorders, right? And even more so in my previous role, right? And they know that they're struggling with substance use. They may not be in a place to like do anything about it, right? But they know they are like they know that there's an issue there. I don't know, you'll be able to see this. So people are usually more aware that there's an issue. And historically, addiction treatment has done things that I think are inappropriate or at worst or ineffective at best, right? Which is kind of trying to break through people's denial, right? If I create this consequence, or they're going to jail, so that should be that should wake them up, right? And really relying on like a consequence, or often an artificially created consequence to think about breaking through denial. Or when I give a talk like this, one of the questions that I often get from people is, what's the thing that your parents said to you that really turned it around for you? Right? Or like, what's the one thing that happened, right? And it's from this really wonderful place. Like, if I can just say the right thing, it's going to change my loved one's whole experience. That's not really how this works, right? It's really much more about consistency. So, some folks might be familiar with this. This is kind of a model of stages of change, okay? And I think stages of change model is a really helpful thing to understand as a loved one. It's certainly helpful to understand just as somebody that works with folks with substance use disorder. In general, right, as people move, right, from pre-contemplation, I'm not thinking about making a change, contemplation, yeah, there's an issue, but I'm kind of weighing the issue, right? There's some good things about my use, some not so good things. Preparation, what would it look like for me to make a change? Action, actively making that change, and then maintenance, how do I sustain that change? In general, people's motivation as they move through this process goes from external to internal, right? Meaning that earlier in a change process, sometimes people do have to have consequences connected to that behavior, right? In order for them to think, oh, I have to make this change. As people kind of internalize this change making, in the case of recovery, kind of making your recovery part of your identity, part of who you are, right? Then somebody has really internalized, like, as a person in recovery, I try to be of service. I try to support people in my community around this issue, right? It's part of who I am. That certainly wasn't the case, right, when I was active in my use, but as I kind of moved through this and this became part of my being, right, the motivation was much more internal. When everything hit the fan and I was, going to jail, and that was a pretty good motivator, at least in the short term, right? To say, oh gosh, I've got to look at something here with my use. So, kind of this means as a helper, right? Whether that's a family member, is that the actions that we take or the way that we respond to our loved one changes as they move through this process. So early on, I might be doing things that are about decreasing desirability, trying to build relationship through empathy. And later on, I might be thinking about providing choice, removing barriers, active helping. So I'll just kind of show you how that might work from one stage to another. So from pre-contemplation, right? Not thinking about making a change at all, right? Behaviors like interactions that do two things: decrease the desirability of continued use, right? And also build relationship are really helpful. Okay, gosh, it really sucks that you crashed your car, right? Or it really sucks that you crashed my car, right? And last night, and you came in after curfew, right? And or you're living in my house, and so I've asked you to be home at midnight, and you banged up my car, right? And as a result of that, right, I'm not going to let you drive my car anymore. Okay, so there's a natural consequence for behavior. You're not punishing, right? You're just saying, this is my car. Here's a natural consequence, right? And and we can do that and also be empathetic that that's going to suck for that person, right? And their first reaction is not going to be, oh yeah, that totally makes sense, right? Oh yeah, that seems appropriate. Like that's not right. Like that's not the way that whatever age people, when they have a consequence, react, right? But we can just kind of understand that when we set a boundary or whatever, right, there's going to be a reaction there, and we don't have to react to that reaction. We can just stand in our action. As we move from contemplation, right, to preparation, this is where things like providing feedback or clarifying goals. So I think about this with students that I work with, and I say, gosh, we've talked about how important it is for you to go to medical school, right? And it seems like on, whenever you have a test on a Friday and you go out the night before, right? Like you don't do well, and it, seems like that's kind of in conflict, right, with this goal that you have around going to med school, right? So I'm kind of just feeding back, right? Not my goals for them, right? Their goals for you. I know this is important to you. You've talked to me about something that's important to you, right? And kind of, have the goals shifted for you, or, what's going on here, right? So this can be really helpful as we move from, right, thinking about trying to help them kind of weigh ambivalence, right? Reasons to change, reasons not to change. Oh, I keep having this consequence that's preventing me from kind of living to my values. And then kind of as we move further in stages of change, right, these are places where, providing choice or removing barriers or active helping can be really great, right? So our loved one has, really caused a lot of damage in their life, right? And they have all these consequences, and they, and you grab, breakfast with them at like about noon on, on a Sunday, right? And they've got this big thing that they're, that they're facing in front of them, okay? And they say, you know what? I really need some help. And you say, here's 3 options, right? Like, here's some different options, right? You've done your homework outside of this as you've kind of observed what's going on, right? And like, here's some things, or here's some people that I've talked to about this. Would you be open to talking to somebody about it, right? Or, hey, I've actually, like, hey, I don't want to leave my kid or my dog. Well, you know what? We've actually thought about that. And, Aunt Sue is going to take the dog, right? And I'm happy to care for your child while you get some help, right? Or like maybe they're going to intensive outpatient. It's like, I'm happy to pick up your dog every day, or feed your dog every day, or pick up your child after work, right? You can provide this active helping, right? And this is really appropriate as your loved one is moving towards these kind of action phases, right? it's different than kind of trying to shield people from the natural consequences of their behavior, right? So the role kind of shifts as they start taking some action or indicating that they're, you know, making some changes, right? Our role as a loved one or a helper, you know, can really change that. Thoughts, questions? Makes sense. Yeah. I think that, yeah, so the question was, are there things that we should say or not say that help them move through that? I think in general, we try to be as non-judgmental as possible, right? And so, you know, one of the focuses is just having a relationship, right? I think it can be really helpful to express appreciation if they've done something well and really focus on, hey, I really appreciate you coming in on time last night, right? And so thinking about how do you keep all of your conversations from being negative or being confronting a behavior or that sort of thing. I think that can be helpful, right? Anything you can do to kind of deepen the relationship. So that, I think that's helpful. You know, really trying to be as detached as you can, or to just try to really separate, right, their disease from them, right? So seeing the best in them. And yeah, I think that's a place to start. Yeah. And we'll have some other ideas as we go through. All right. I don't hate you as much as you think I do, but I will tell you where you can, right? So, you know, people say things they really don't mean, right? In the realities of active addiction, right? And as people are defending this thing that might be one of the only things in their life that is working for them, right? And so it creates a lot of tension, right? And I know we're in a church, so sorry, team. Haven't given this talk in this context before. But there is just a lot of tension here, right? That is created, right, in the reality of these relationships, right? And so trying to catch your loved one doing something right, right? Trying to think about, so you may be in a situation where you're not living together, right? Your loved one, you have very limited interactions with your loved one, right? How do you set up those interactions in a way that's most likely to be a positive interaction so you can build that relationship? Because one of the things, so I am not a believer in this kind of tough love, and I'll speak to that in a little bit, right? I think that's, for many of us, has been the message as family members: tough love, hard boundaries, right? Cut them off, right? And right, addiction robs us of the capacity. This is a Father Bill quote that I just have always connected with. It robs us of the capacity to have intimate, lasting relationships with ourselves, with other human beings, and with any sort of higher purpose, until the most important relationship in our lives is with the substance itself, right? So the experience of addiction is increasing isolation over time, where the primary relationship that people have becomes with the substance. And it is really important for us to reconnect with human beings, right, in order to heal. And so your loved ones are infinitely better off for the fact that you are getting resources and getting support and you are engaged in their lives. I will never push a family member away from being involved in their loved ones' lives. You might be the most important thing keeping them alive, right? There may be some things that you could change that you might be a little more effective, or might be able to be a little bit more proud of the way that you're showing up for your loved one, right? And so we can kind of tweak those things. But the fact that you are showing up matters. Okay. Go ahead.
I just have a comment from Jennifer online.
Yeah.
I think that is hard sometimes because people move back and forth on this flow chart.
Yeah.
And what seems appropriate at one point isn't appropriate in another place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a great point, right? And I think one of the things for me that's really helpful is by looking at this kind of stages of change here, is to just try to place your loved one right on that, right? And don't try to jump ahead, right? Don't try to skip steps. So like they're in the contemplation space, right? Like they're in active use, but they're thinking about it, right? And we're like, well, you need to be going to a meeting every day, or we need to get you in treatment right away, right? And so we're creating some unrealistic expectations that is creating more tension in the relationship, and it's not necessarily moving them more towards that change. Okay, so if we can recognize where somebody is in that moment, then we can think about, okay, how do I work with them to just move them one place forward, right? How do I move from, okay, they're thinking about it, to wondering, what would a change look like? How would I go about making that change, right? That's progress. Okay, so oftentimes, and you know, it's funny because as a peer specialist, we're supposed to always be like, you know what you need, and let's support you in your goals. And I think there's some really important stuff in empowering people and in recognizing that folks often do have some insight into what they need, and working with folks with addiction also for a decade and a half. Often people have huge blind spots, right, in terms of what they really need to be successful, right? Like rehab love is a thing, right, that happens a lot. It's like, hey, I just, I'm 1 week out of detox, and I actually met this person in detox, right? And we're gonna get married, and it's gonna solve everything. Right? So like colossally bad decisions are not limited to folks in active addiction. Like people in early recovery make real bad decisions too, right? And so I just think about working with college students, working with young people, that almost all my students have severe substance use disorder. They have addiction, right? And they really, really do not want to be as sick as they often are, right? They do not want to be as impacted by their substance use as they are, right? And so there is, like, sometimes we just lack self-awareness. Is actually like part of the brain that is impacted by sustained substance use, impacts our ability to see ourselves as we really are, right? And it takes time for that thing to heal. This is really fascinating. So this is some research that's been done around, it's really about craving. And I always try to do a little brain science because I think it really connects for people in terms of really being able to treat addiction as a disease. So what we have here is people are hooked up with these skull caps, right? You've seen those on TV. Sometimes they do cool stuff with like mindfulness and whatever, all these like wires going out of their head, right? People have seen those, right? Okay. So they're called EEG machines, and they measure brainwave activity, right? And so if it's, higher is more brainwave activity. And this is a fascinating study where they show people with cocaine use disorder, and they show them two different cues, right, at separate times. So the first cue is a drug-related cue, might be a crack stem, might be a line of coke, whatever, right? And the second cue, the other cue, is a neutral cue, like a duck, right? It's like something that is not going to get people real excited, right? So what's really fascinating, and what they're doing here is they're measuring craving in two ways: the difference in these two lines, right, and the amount of time it takes for those two lines to normalize, right, to go back to the same. And what's really fascinating about this is, so you have a difference here at 1 week, right? But it actually goes back to normal relatively quickly, right? You have a difference here that's a little bit bigger at 1 month. It takes quite a long time for it to go back to normal. And kind of at the end of this period, it still hasn't gone back to normal. But what's interesting here is the biggest sustained difference, right? The strongest and longest craving is happening 6 months after 6 months of abstinence, right? So this really speaks to, one aspect of how powerful addiction is, right? We see a pretty normal activity here at 1 year, which is encouraging in terms of this metric. But I think it's really important to understand, and a lot of times, right, your loved one is not going to understand that about themselves unless they've had some good psychoeducation, whether they're talking to somebody that knows something about addiction, right? And oftentimes we as family members have really high expectations of people pretty quickly into their recovery. When the reality is that their brain is really still in very early staging here. Anybody had a concussion before, right? And if we had like 5 people who had concussions here, right, we probably have 5 pretty different experiences about how long it took them to like get their brain totally back online, right? Got a friend that had a bad motorcycle accident. It took him 3.5 years to get mostly full functioning of his brain back, right? And so I think a lot of times like a brain injury is a really good analogy to think about what your loved one is navigating in early recovery. And so one of the things I think that family members can be really helpful in is helping people kind of navigate and connect to longer term recovery supports, right? So I think like we have a big access issue. We're working on this stuff, right? We have an initial access issue. We don't do a great job of catching people when they're incarcerated, when they get in trouble, when they're hospitalized. We don't do a great job of getting people into treatment initially, right? So there's an access gap. We don't connect them to an appropriate next level of care very well, right? And then we don't provide like great continuing care. So this model, we have a few subpopulations that in certain circumstances do extremely well with their substance use disorders. So some of those subpopulations are doctors and airline pilots and college students that participate in collegiate recovery programs. Okay. So, and I will say that the airline pilots and the doctors do even better than the college students, not really surprisingly, but it's a little bit of a different circumstance. But this kind of model is based on kind of, this is kind of what we do for physicians, historically, what we've done for physicians that get in trouble with their substance use, right? And one of the pieces of wisdom that we've discovered with, that we failed to apply to other situations is to look at this as a safety issue, okay? So think about physicians and airline pilots. What do they have in common when it comes to substance use? You really don't want them using substances when they're doing their job for you, right? You really don't want them drunk or high when they're doing their job, okay? Can we agree on that? I think that's right. So it's a safety issue, and it's not just a safety issue for them, right? It's a safety issue for the public, right? And what we realize is it's safer not to incentivize them to be dishonest, right? We want to incentivize them to self-report, right? So that they can get the help that they need and they don't have to blow up their whole lives, right? If you're a pilot or a doctor, right? And you have done all of this education and all of this training and make a good living, right? And then you have a really bad substance use disorder, right? Now you have to say, okay, what do I do here, right? And if there isn't a safe way to self-report, then you are like, oh, well, I just have to right? because I have to decide between my license, right, and and making a living and that sort of thing, right? So figured out, like, if we help people self-report, and then if we provide them a really, really good treatment and a really good continuum of care, guess what? They do really, really well. And the studies of physicians' health programs in Virginia, it's called HPMP, Health Practitioners Monitoring Program. Historically, studies of these have shown them to be extremely effective, like 85% 5-year abstinence from substances, even with physicians with very severe opioid use disorders and other substance use disorders, right? So we can be really, really effective with those populations, right? And very much like the work we do in collegiate recovery builds off of that model, right? Like, they have this kind of carrot and stick situation going on, right? If you do these things, you get to keep your license and you can practice and you can do these good things. And if you don't, we're going to take your license, right? And we're going to monitor you because there's a public safety thing going on. And so there's this high accountability, high high positive reward, high negative on the other side. Really effective. Well, there's some other things that really work about those programs too, right? One is that you're providing care for 5 years, right? You're also providing support that is kind of built into their identities, right? Doctors are generally very proud of being doctors. Pilots are really glad to be pilots, right? College students want to be college students. There's identity there. And when you can connect people with that shared identity, that is a really powerful thing, right? And so we can think about that in other areas as well, that it can be very, very powerful, whether that's like racial affinity groups sometimes can be really, really powerful in recovery. It can be really hard to be in a recovery space and be the only person of color in a recovery space, right? Or it can be really hard if you think you're the only LGBTQ person in a recovery space, right? So it can be really powerful to create environments, right, that support people in different identities, right? And one of the cool things about, and this is a little bit of an aside about the pandemic though, is that there are much more available affinity spaces through virtual environments where people, even if you're in a place where lots of people don't share your identities, you may be able to connect virtually with a bunch of folks that do share your identities, and that can be really powerful.
Yeah, so I just have a few comments from Zoom.
Sure.
One thing was, I mean, we're going here. So let's see. This is from Karen. Growing up, family intervention was the standard of care to help a person to get into recovery, which I see as ambushing a person. Is that still the same approach today? Also, how to handle when someone has an addictive personality and now starts doing a legal drug like marijuana.
Sure. I'm not going to touch the second one because we don't have time. But I'll just,
and you want me to read all of these?
We're not going to go through all of them,
great.
I don't think, just because I got like 4 or 5 more.
Okay, so I'll
10 things. But I will just say something like about interventions. So interventions are generally not available to most people. They're mostly available to people that are pretty wealthy. And interventions can mean a whole lot of different things. If you think of the idea of intervention as a process and not an event, it can be a very helpful way to think about making a systemic shift in the way your family interacts with somebody that has substance use disorder. So people that do interventions well and responsibly, they do a lot of this, right? They help families get educated on the disease of addiction. They help families change the way that they respond to their loved one, right? And they help people plan and make connections between levels of care, right? So there's a lot of really good interventionists out there that do those things, right? But the idea of like ambushing somebody or as intervention as an event, I think is really irresponsible. But the idea of, hey, we're going to take a family approach to address addiction and try to get you help and wrap our arms around you, that I think there's a real place for that. And that's frankly what we're doing here. And this is somewhere where family members really can make a big difference. In terms of recovery, there's a lot more research that's about recovery now. Not enough, but more. And we've kind of mostly studied, addiction and recovery in very short-term situations. This is a study from Harvard called the National Recovery Study. And I reference this in most talks that I give because I think it's very powerful. So they asked a representative sample of Americans, about 25,000 people, did you once have a problem with drugs or alcohol, and do you no longer have that issue? And about 9% of them will say, yes, I've resolved an issue with alcohol or other drugs. A lot of people, right? And of those folks, they asked them questions like, how long has it been? And then what's your quality of life, happiness, recovery capital as a measure of people's resources for recovery, self-esteem, and then the one going down over time is psychological distress. So over time, people's lives get better and they have less psychological distress, right? Makes sense. What's really interesting about this study is two things. One, it's about 15 years where people's average quality of life is that of the general population. So it takes the average person who has a substance use disorder and gets into recovery or resolves that issues quite a long time to achieve just average quality of life. So we're not very good at helping people heal in a robust way. We might be okay at helping them survive, but we're not really helping restore them well enough, right? And the other thing about it is that this is a best fit curve. So this is an average of these data points. And if you zoom in, right, if they look at this data up close and they look at the first 2 years of data, what people self-report is that things get harder before they get better, right? So it's in the same kind of period of time where we think about that, the cocaine cue, is that, we say in our community, early recovery can really suck, right, for people, right? And oftentimes what's happening is there's a lot of expectations, both by the person and by the people around them. And it's like, okay, you did that, you're over that, get on with it, right? Like, and the reality is that their brain is still heavily impacted by their substance use, right? And so there's psychological distress. Now, the good news here is that recovery capital, which really predicts long-term recovery, is still going up here. So they're kind of doing the things they should be doing, but it's really hard, right? And this is somewhere where family can be really helpful if they can really step back and say, we really want you to be well over a long period of time, right? And so we're gonna work with you on this. You may need to it was really helpful for me that when I came and lived at home in early recovery and I needed to go to a meeting, my family never gave me stuff about missing dinner, about missing a family event, or they said, hey, we have this event, it's a family event. I know that there's going to be alcohol there. You can come or not come, it's okay. Because they're taking a long view, right? Or, hey, if you need to go to a meeting before, great. Or we travel, what do you need? So really I think this is a space where family can make a difference. One last brain slide, because I think people like brain slides. So this is, these are PET scans. So these are scans like if we cut the top of your brain like this, right? I use these, I've been using this for a long time because I think it's really helpful for families to think about what's going on with their loved one. So this is dopamine activity. What's dopamine important for? Okay, it feels good. It's the feeling of pleasure, right? And why is it important for us evolutionarily to feel pleasure? Keeps us alive. So it rewards certain behaviors, right? It's really important for us to know that chocolate cake will save us from starvation, right? And broccoli will not, right? So good short-term strategy, right? Need the sugar, keep the brain moving, right? Bad long-term strategy, right? But it's a perfect example of how addiction works, right? It's a reward for this short-term, near-term pleasurable experience, right? And what you see at 1 month of abstinence is kind of very little dopamine activity, right? And so I think about dopamine, motivation and reward. You're back in the day, you're hunting, gathering. You know, I see the apple tree, I see the cows in the distance. I usually do a vegan example, but I see the cows in the distance. I run to the cows and I get myself a steak, right? Motivation, right? Seeing the cows, right? I get a little hit of dopamine, running to the cows, you know, doing my thing, and reward, I eat the steak, right? So usually I do an apple, but I saw a cow, like literally. So anyway, so this is really important for survival, right? But this is not working right for people in early recovery, right? And so there's a whole set of impacts that people experience in early recovery. We call this kind of generally post-acute withdrawal syndrome, right? So it's really normal for people to have anhedonia, being pleasure deaf, right? So maybe there were things your loved one used to love to do early in recovery. They're like, it's okay, you know, whatever, right? Sleeping, right? They might actually starting to sleep effectively again, but they're really aware that they're having crazy dreams, using dreams, those sorts of things. It's actually a sign that things are starting to come back online, but it's really normal for people to report difficulty sleeping because they're really aware of their sleep, right? Priority setting, right? So we've hacked this system, this dopamine system, right, to give us rewards for all sorts of things that historically were not rewarding, right? So I think about college students. How many things do my students have to do that are not deeply intrinsically rewarding to get their college degree, right? They're just checkbox. Anybody a checklist maker? Yeah. You ever put something on your checklist that you already did just so you could cross it off? Right? This is dopamine, right? Like we've hacked this system, right, to survive this weird world that we live in where things on your checklists are very important. Okay, cool. Consistency matters, but not for me, right? I think it is really important for families to try to take the long view and to say, and to really try to get to this perspective that this is unlikely to be solved right now. And it's unlikely to be solved maybe in the next year, maybe in the next 5 years. Okay. And like that this is not a day-to-day thing. This is a long-term thing, right? So how can I take care of myself in a way that I can show up consistently over time for my loved one, right? Because it makes sense, right, that we operate from this traumatized place because we're trying to save our loved one's life. They're oftentimes, especially with the way the drug supply is, they're often in immediate danger. And there are times where we might act in a way to try to save somebody from a really severe immediate danger. And I think it's really important for us to really take the long view and to say, how do I show up consistently for my loved one? Like, how am I going to be okay if this goes on for 5 more years, right? How do I take care of myself in a way that allows me to be consistent for my loved one over a long period of time? Part of that is because it is, you know, it's natural to react inconsistently with our loved one, often because we're trying like a whole bunch of things, thinking that it's going to change everything, right? And kind of recognizing that intermittent reinforcement is actually the strongest reinforcer, right? So we think about like gambling, right? Or training dogs, right? You're most effective, right, training a dog if this time you give them a treat every 3rd time, this time every 5th time, this time every 2nd time, right? And so what often happens is like we as families are thinking about how do we support our loved one, and we just kind of keep changing the way that we approach it, right? Or like you're like, oh, she's like, give me the keys, give me the keys, give me the keys. You're like, no, 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 no. Oh, fine, take the keys, right? And that's really normal, right? Like you get worn down, your loved one might do some stuff to just wear you down, and they know eventually they're going to kind of get in there. And again, this is where having support, right, doing what you need to do to take care of yourself will allow you to be consistent, right? To allow you to be a consistent, positive presence in your loved one's life and a connection for them when they say, you know what, I'm exhausted and I really need help, right? And so finding ways to be consistent is, and I think that framing this as, because the individual, I have to apologize for my profession, okay? So I think that addiction, like we as addictions professionals for a long time have sat with a family member and they've told us 5 minutes of their loved one's experience, this very small window of their experience. And we've said, here are all the things you need to do, as though we're experts on their life, right? And you may have been on the receiving end of many of these conversations, and I just don't think that's right. Because one, each of these situations is individual and really complex and complicated. And two, what I want for you is to find the behaviors that you can, the ways you interact with your loved one that you can live with, right? That are right for you, that are okay for you. It is, for some families, it might be like, hey, like I need this person not to live here because it's not safe for me for this person to live here. For other people, it's like, I'm never going to kick my loved one out of my house. And if that's where you're at, that's okay. There's still lots of things that you can do to positively impact the relationship. And that it might not even be the right thing for them to leave the house, right? So really thinking about that these are really individual situations, and we walk through them together as community. It really is important to have other people you talk to about it, like run things by, because these are really hard decisions, right? That you have to live with. Okay. So that leads me to, I think maybe this should be number one, telling me that you care never hurts, right? It might not change my behavior today, but it is never a bad thing to tell your loved one that you love them and you care about them and you want them to get well, right? And that's always a worthwhile thing to do, right? And this kind of like whole like tough love thing, right? If we, lots of people talk about tough love, but if you're just cutting somebody off, and you're saying, I can't help you, that's not tough love. It may be the only thing that you have left and you just are like done with it and you were cutting it off, but that's not tough love. Tough love is, well, I just don't, I think that the term has been really problematic, but if you're gonna do the tough part, right? And you say, okay, I'm gonna ask you to not be in my house. Love is to say, here is how I can engage with you. Here's how I can support you, right? Here's how I can show up for you, right? But just cutting somebody out of our lives, right, is not tough love. It sometimes it's the thing that we need to do to take care of ourselves, and that is okay, right? That may be loving yourself, but it's not a solution to somebody's addiction. And if you really want to dig more into this, there's the Invitation to Change. This Jan Brown and SpiritWorks Foundation does a lot of training around this this approach to families. It's called Invitation to Change. It's put together, the curriculum's put together by the Center for Motivation and Change. Really, really wonderful curriculum. Just that's about helping families and kind of in these different ways. How do you interact better with your loved one? How do you gain empathy? And how do you take care of yourselves in terms of inviting people to make changes in their life? Okay, we're almost there. Okay, when you do things for me that I can do for myself, I feel disempowered, right? But please do them anyway. So I know that lots of you, like we've all heard the term enabling, and I hate the term enabling. Like, you will not hear me use that term with families, okay? In almost all contexts outside of substance use, enabling is a positive thing, right? And right, like enabling somebody to get an education, right? Enabling, right? Like, so, but we've kind of used this as this tool that shames families. So you won't hear that word from me in working with a family, right? But I really like this concept of this kind of measuring stick when you're thinking about when you're kind of agonizing over a decision with your loved one, like, should I support them in this way or not? Am I empowering them or am I disempowering them? Right. And so one thing I will say is like helping your loved one navigate a really broken substance use and mental health services delivery system is not empowering, is not, in that negative context, enabling them, right? It's really helping somebody with a broken brain navigate a really hard system and kind of helping, empower them to make changes in their health, right? So, I think that's a helpful tool to think about, like, okay, am I doing something for this person that they can reasonably do from themselves? And by doing that, am I keeping them from getting agency in their life, right? And kind of using that as a kind of soft measuring stick for how you're going to support your loved one. Okay. I need to figure this out for myself, right? So there's ways in which people really do need to kind of navigate these situations, especially in early recovery, and figure out some things. And you may have been telling them the solution for like 2 decades, and then they call you and they're like, hey mom, like, it's the wildest thing, but I was having a problem and I called this guy, and it's the guy you've told them to call for like 27 times. Like, I called this guy and he had this great advice, and then I went and did it, and everything was great, right? And it's like, okay, so, there is, like, people do need to feel empowered to make changes. And they also need support. They also need support and connection. And so that kind of thing. So, anyway, there we go. So, it's important to me that you are okay, right? But I lack the capacity to think about your needs above my own. So I have never, ever sat down with someone who, in their right mind, like, was like, gosh, I really wish that my family member hadn't gotten the support that they got around my addiction. Right? Like, when you as a family member take care of yourself, right, and do what you need to take care of your own health and happiness and healing, right? That is actually a huge gift that you are giving to your loved one. Because if they have the opportunity to get well, right? And most people do get well from addiction, right? That is something that they do not have to feel guilty about, right? Because you took care of yourself, right? And so it's really, really important, right? Even like folks I work with, like, even in their worst like moments and even low point, right? They know the people that care about them, and they want them to be okay, and they want them to thrive, right? And they may never be able to say that to you, right? But it is a real gift to them for you to do the things that you need to do to take care of yourself, right? Because it just takes that right off of them. They're going to have a lot of challenges ahead of them as they kind of go in and navigate if they have severe addiction, right? They're going to have some real challenges. And for them to know that you have support as they start to get well, right? And that you have a community, that really makes a huge difference, right? In them being able to like to move forward with their lives, right? They don't have to kind of sit in this burden of, gosh, I messed up, all of this stuff, because you took care of yourself, right, as best you could. Okay. Yeah, just kind of a reference back, right, to this invitation to change, which is heavily and influenced the way I think about work for families, is behaviors make sense. Everybody is different. Like, if somebody prescribes for you the answer for your loved one after a 3-minute conversation, that may not be the person you need to be talking to about this. It is really normal for people to be ambivalent, right? And really thinking about caring for yourselves right, as family members really can be critical because it can be a really long journey. So like I said, they do a wonderful job at Spirit Works. If you ever get a chance to do training with Jan Brown, it will make a big difference in your life. She's a personal hero of mine and one of the kind of the people that I certainly look to in the recovery movement around how we make real changes. Okay, and this is me. So I got 4 minutes for questions. So I'll just tell a quick story that I tell a lot, but I really like one of the things that I know that there is a ton of there's a ton of collateral damage, right? When we think about addiction, right? We think about all the collateral damage that happens, right? But when people get and stay well, right? When we support people in their journey to recovery, there is a ton of collateral healing. And I've seen this happen not just in terms of the person that is impacted, right? The person that has the addiction getting and staying well, but also I've seen that in family members, regardless of some of the tragic things that have happened to their loved ones. That I have seen so many family members find a way to create ripple effects of healing because they took care of themselves, right? Because they cared about this issue and because they weren't afraid to speak up about stuff that was going on and kind of break through some of the silence and shame that is just part of our experience with addiction. And just that the impact, right? The ripple effects of collateral healing is just incredibly important. And for me, like I took my 20-year-old cousin to her first recovery meeting 16 years ago. And she was having a hard time. We used to use together. She was having a really hard time. And we were a family gathering. Everybody's using or drinking, using, same thing. Right. And she was struggling. And we went to a recovery meeting. She ended up getting real involved in a recovery group and just celebrated 16 years of recovery, And so like I didn't know that when I started making a change, right? Like I didn't know that I would really need that, to make sense of my own addiction journey, to see like this person that I love and care about get well, in part because some people showed up and helped me get well, right? But it's made such a huge difference in our family. Now people in our family, like if there's somebody struggling, like there's 4 of us now, there's really good support there, and there's a very different language, right? And you get to kind of use this experience to really transform your family if you choose to do that. So yeah, thanks again for having me. Thanks, Marissa, and everybody that helped put this on, and food and all that. So it's awesome. Guess I can do like one question. Do one question, or does anybody have? I can just stick around and answer questions if people have questions.
All right, informal. Great.
Awesome. Yeah, if you have a loved one, there's naloxone back there. If you have a loved one that has struggled with opioids or is even using any illicit substance, learn to use naloxone. Well, there's a bunch of us that here that would be happy to show you how to use naloxone. That's actually a decent conversation. Like even if your loved one's not living with you, right, and you know that they're using some substances, it's a great way to engage with your loved one in a non-judgmental, I care about your health kind of way. Hey, I got trained on naloxone. I don't know quite what's going on, but I really want you to have this, right? You can, learn about how to use it online. I just want to make sure that you have access to this. I care about your health and well-being, right? And it's a way to just have a non-judgmental health-focused conversation with your loved one about how they can be a little bit more safe. So yeah, thanks for providing that. All right.